Yes, yes. $1.5. Oika aka leo. Oika. Ready to go. Right. In the words of Dr. Carlo Miller, our ancestors speak. We will not come to speak numbers. We will not be stuck in small cages of spreadsheets. We come accounting for generations to come, knowing our blue bonds are to the ocean, earth and sky. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and our participants back in the islands from which we come, I welcome you to this side event, and I would like to introduce to you our distinguished panel of speakers. This side event will be run in two parts, and primarily in the first, it is to hear from the faces, the voices and the faces behind the negotiators here in Glasgow. They too have come from our shores, from far away. Our first message, however, in this side event is from the Honourable Prime Minister of Samoa, the government of Samoa, the Honourable Fiame Naomi Mataafa. This is her statement to the COP. And we are privileged to have the opportunity to hear this message here. We then have our speakers who have joined me here, who are Le Maima Va'ai from the Methodist Church, PCC, Pacific Conference of Churches, Economical Enabler for Ecological Stewardship and Climate Justice on my right. We are also joined by Sala Dr. George Carter to my left, research fellow, Director of Pacific Institute of ANU. He is also a member of the NUA delegation and also has joined SPREP and has been kindly assisted by Australia. To my immediate right, I have my friend here, Maina Talia from the Tuvalu Climate Action Network, and he will share voices from Tuvalu at COP26. Ladies and gentlemen, this side event is made up of speakers who will share their reflections of what it means to be here, what it means to be in Glasgow, what it means to be a Pacific Islander, and what it means to be a Pacific Islander in the spaces that they occupy: academia, the church, the state. So following this, we will also feature the Mana Moana videos, and I will introduce the Mana Moana messages later. So without further ado, and I would like to invite our first presentation. It is a pre-recorded message from the Honourable Prime Minister of the Government of Samoa, the Honourable Fiame Naomi Mataafa.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Climate change has long been an interwoven fabric of life for the Blue Pacific, including Samoa, over decades. As small island developing states, we first told the world that our coastlines were eroding, the sea level was rising, and climate change was human-induced. Many did not take our concerns seriously. Some wanted scientific evidence, while others remained in denial. Now, the recent IPCC reports confirm all this and more. As humanity, there is no time for second guessing. We need to act urgently and decisively with much higher climate ambition to correct our mistakes that led to the current climate crisis. We acknowledge efforts by all parties that have committed to ambitious climate action. However, it is concerning that there is still a wide emissions gap in meeting the 1.5 Celsius goal. Even with limiting warming to 1.5 Celsius, SIDS will continue to incur severe loss and damage. Exceeding this will be catastrophic for us. Hence, the constant iteration by the Blue Pacific leaders that climate change is the single greatest threat to our people and islands. We recognize the double burden of addressing the parallel crises of climate change and the pandemic, but we stand to lose a lot more if we remain in a state of inaction. The COVID-19 pandemic should not delay ambitious climate action. Instead, sustainable economic recovery should be catalyzed through investments that are clean, climate smart, and in line with net zero emissions by 2050. The development of COVID-19 vaccines was the fastest in history. Its rollout around the world at large scale required a massive global coordinated effort. I often ponder on how we can push for this historical, united, urgent, global response at the same massive scale to help us reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius promise of the Paris Agreement. For us as the Blue Pacific, we need to inject some of that urgency and ambitious actions, like what we achieved with the COVID-19 vaccinations, to deliver the needed climate action. It is in Glasgow that climate urgency enters the collective consciousness. We must ensure through commitments and our decisions at COP26 that we keep the hope of the 1.5 degree world. This is our point of no return. But we as SIDS know that despite our best efforts, the real impact to reverse the cycle of decline we are in relies on the will and commitment of others. For this reason, we will persist to call on everyone, especially the major emitters, to commit to ambitious emissions cuts by 2030. Implement commitments consistent with the 1.5 Celsius scenario and net zero global emissions by 2050. Nature-based solutions should take precedence in our sustainable development efforts. Phasing out of coal plants and all fossil fuel subsidies and investments are critical. We continue to stress the importance of the delivery of the US $100 billion goal to ensuring the implementation of ambitious mitigation commitments. However, funding for the root causes of climate change is exponentially greater than funding for the response to climate change. This must change. We need to ensure a new scaled-up climate finance goal that builds on the US $100 billion floor. We must guarantee a balanced allocation of climate finance between mitigation and adaptation. Climate finance made available to SIDS are still insufficient and mainly in the form of loans. SIDS must receive scaled up, adequate, predictable, and long-term support from the international community to adapt. Loss and damage needs dedicated funding. COP26 must address the long-term and permanent consequences of insufficient climate action. While we urge for COP26 to conclude negotiations on the Paris rulebook, it is important that it adopts a markets mechanism which delivers meaningful global emissions reductions. We must ensure that we continue to uphold the principle of environmental integrity and keep the Paris Agreement promise. This is critical when finalizing COP26 outcomes. Lastly, but not the least, the ocean absorbs nearly a quarter of annual carbon dioxide emissions and plays a central role in regulating the Earth's climate. The climate-ocean nexus is clear. Thus, oceans needs to feature more in the work of the UNFCCC. This is an important priority for the Blue Pacific. Furthermore, slow and onset events such as sea level rise due to climate change threatens the security of our maritime zones. This is why the Pacific leaders have endorsed the Declaration on Preserving Maritime Zones in the face of climate change-related sea level rise. The declaration states very clearly our region's collective position and commitment to maintaining our maritime zones without reduction in the face of climate change-related sea level rise. Excellencies, climate change is at the heart of our vulnerabilities as nations and peoples. While we may be the worst affected, the real solution is not in our hands, especially when it comes to global emission reductions. However, through the COP26 negotiations and the multilateral process, we hope to shape the solutions to save our planet. There are no trade-offs. We are negotiating the survival of our islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the government of Samoa for the privilege of sharing that message today through this side event. For that, we are grateful. And I think that sets the scene quite well for us as we segue into the next speakers. So from state to church to academia, the real people of the Pacific. I would like to invite at this time a young woman, Lemaima Va'ai, to talk to us about what it means to be an ecumenical enabler for ecological stewardship and climate justice within the space that she occupies. Lemaima.
Thank you, Tangaloa, for the question. I think for me, with my work that I'm doing at the Pacific Conference of Churches, specifically focusing around ecological stewardship and climate justice, we really try to utilize God's mission of justice to influence meaningful and long-term change within our churches and to its people as well. And through this, we then project it through what we like to call the 3 Ps, which is being prophetic, pastoral, as well as practical as well. Prophetic in a sense where we're speaking out on the acts of injustices towards our people in the Pacific, or not just that, but also other indigenous communities around the world, those who are marginalized, those who are oppressed. When it comes to pastoral, trying to bring in the theological aspect within our social justice issues, and practical, literally walking the talk, putting action to your talking as well. When it comes to ecological stewardship and climate justice, I like to speak on it in terms of our spirituality, not just from a faith perspective, but also from an indigenous perspective as well. So there's this saying back home that, I'm from Samoa, by the way, but there's a saying back home which goes, "Ele falala fualengiu, ai falala onol matangi," meaning that the coconut tree doesn't sway on its own, but it is swayed by the wind. I really like this proverb because it really defines our indigenous belief as Pasifika people that all things are connected, that our whawheloa'i, or our relationship towards the other, is extended beyond human interaction. And this is really what ecological stewardship and climate justice is about. Over my years of climate activism work, I've come to really appreciate the cultures of our Pacific people, especially in terms of spirituality, and how they connect this through, whether it would be their Christian spirituality or their indigenous. And through that, this spirituality really shows that it is life-affirming, and it gives us this holistic view where we visualize our environment as part of our ainga, or our family. That's specifically, to me, what ecological stewardship and climate justice is about, in a small, short sense.
Thank you very much, Moana. Thank you for sharing, giving us a perspective, an insight into the work that you do, which is both honourable and meaningful. And I think it is a very commendable, for a young woman in this space, and perhaps in the Pacific, a very normal transition for a young person raised in the church, but to come all the way to Glasgow and bring that work with you. How do you find, what would be the biggest challenges for you in this space in Glasgow, in the work that you do?
I think this is my first COP, so at the moment I'm still very much getting myself familiar with each of the spaces. But I guess some of the challenges, if I was to speak on a personal level, not based here at COP, but based on my engagements with communities, is when you're and some of the challenges that I have faced is when you're speaking to communities about the climate crisis and trying to bring in the theological aspect within it. Sometimes they like to use the Bible and say that this climate crisis is because it's God's punishment towards it, but that's not the case. And so it's really hard trying to bring in that theological aspect, trying to show that it is not because of God's punishment, but it's because of it's humans' actions towards it, which has caused it. And then from there, really trying to get our Pacifica community to shift or to change their mindsets towards that. So that's some of the challenges that I do face going through this journey in working with communities in regards to the climate crisis and so forth, or working.
Thank you, Nemaiman. If there was one thing that you're particularly proud of in the work that you do for climate justice, what would that be?
I think, well, I don't think, but I know, is I'm really proud of being a young Pacifica I would say a young daughter of the Pacific, being able to come out, especially given this platform and an international space to really share or amplify the voices or the stories of our Pacific communities, especially towards their climate realities, and really being the prophetic voice, as how we like to say it at PCC, the prophetic voice, or sharing the voice of those of the voiceless. And that's a real privilege to me, and I'm always grateful for that opportunity to be given this space to share and amplify our stories of our Pacifica communities. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jemima. We're particularly proud of you as a young woman in Glasgow and then at the COP here with our negotiators. Thank you very much. And we will come back to at the end of the session for a little bit of Q&A time before we move to the Mana Moana component of our side event. But let me invite at this time Salah Dr. George Carter, who is, as I introduced earlier, a research fellow and director of the Pacific Institute of the Australian National University on Pacific negotiators and moral diplomacy. And I just would like to ask, Salah has joined the Pacific on this journey and providing technical support through SPREP to our delegations and also to SPREP. So I give you the floor, Salah, and I would like for our audience to hear what climate diplomacy is. You know, what does it mean in a space that is not particularly diplomatic? Thank you. You have the floor, George.
Mua na o whātulo, whātalo whātu pa ia malu. O si o tātou tunu, whapea fōi, nisi o loo whaafonga mai, I lunga upenga whatailangi, e alaile I Pasifika, tālo whātalo whalawa. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Tangaloa, and also to the organizers of this panel for this platform to allow not only members of our present here today in our side event, but as well as those online, to see the faces of the voices of Pacific peoples here in Glasgow. Many came with the message to amplify that Pacific voice here in Glasgow, and this is an opportunity because we are well aware that our leaders were here in the last 2 days, as well as the fact we have political champions in terms of ministers. We also have a robust team of technical negotiators, but there are also others beyond this process who are here in Glasgow through the work of our NGO, the work of our media, the work of our regional organizations, which are part and parcel of this Pacific voice or Pacific Voices in COP. And so my area of research and expertise is in the area of diplomacy and Pacific studies, but I focus on Pacific negotiators, so small states in multilateral international negotiations. I specifically look at how small states influence international politics, or how small states influence multilateral consensus decision making. You know, we understand international relations as the realm of the great powers, of the middle powers, but we give little attention to how small powers influence international politics. We tend to situate this in terms of economic might, in terms of military might. But we ask ourselves, how do these small countries or negotiators from these countries or leaders from these countries or NGOs from these countries, especially of the Pacific, how can they really influence? And so we learn, you know, we see this over and over. We hear this word, moral diplomacy. And it's they provide the moral compass. And that is, in fact, one of the greatest legacy of Pacific Island states in international politics, is that they set the agenda in terms of environmental integrity, in terms of sustainable development, in terms of issues pertaining to small island states, that they are able to set the agenda and say, look, this is where we need this attention. But beyond agenda setting, we've seen this over and over the last 30 years within UNFCCC, that Pacific Island states, in terms of leaders, negotiators, as well as NGOs, are all part and parcel of this great project. We understand that UNFCCC, there are parallel meetings happening at the same time. And as we've moved from Paris, where it's now a voluntary agreement, it really needs all different partners to participate in amplifying through, in the hope, a consolidated voice. So we see this in terms of how negotiators work with other coalitions, especially the Alliance of Small Island States, the work with the least developing countries, the work with G77, Coalition of Rainforests. This is part and parcel of the politics and the dynamics with inside negotiations. And that's just one aspect of working within the coalitions. The other great part is multi-actor partnerships. That it's not just state officials, they're partnerships with academics like myself, they're partnerships with church groups, partnerships with media, partnerships with regional organizations that work together with inside these coalitions or with inside state delegations to provide technical support in terms of legal leadership, legal advice, scientific advice, strategic advice. And this is all part and parcel of the work that's conducted or done here in meetings such as this. But then third and foremost, a part of this moral leadership is climate leadership. And that the message is always seen, is always promoted. You're not doing enough, so let us show you how it's done. And that is part of the solution-oriented service or contributions that Pacific Island states, through their leaders, through their negotiators, through the work of NGOs, conduct here in meetings such as a Conference of the Parties here in Glasgow. They provide solutions, and part of these solutions is bringing forth agendas like loss and damage that was set forth not only from 1990, but strengthened by Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, and other states, especially in the run-up to Paris. And then more importantly, we now hear oceans. The need to, it's now well established, there is a relationship between ocean and climate change, but we need to do more. So these are not only pinpointing other areas, but also suggesting solutions in terms of how the world or the global community can work or deal with climate change. But part and parcel of this role is the important role of regional organizations. They are the backbone or behind the scenes, especially the Secretariat Pacific Region Environmental Program and their leadership around the one crop. They are essential in the glue to trying to keep what we say the canoe here in Glasgow working. But more importantly in this, especially in this year of the pandemic, is the fact that our leaders are not here, our negotiators are not all here. And so what you most would not aware of, while some people may be sleeping, there is a back team in Samoa, in Fiji, in Vanuatu, who are working around the clock to provide that support for negotiators here. And so the pandemic has also taught us that for the Pacific, it's hybrid diplomacy. More than ever. I think in past years there have been the opportunities, but this year you can see this strengthened through the work of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Natural Resources, are all working 24 hours to try and support. When I conducted the research in the making of the Paris, there were about 345 delegates from the 14 Pacific Island states participating. This year, unfortunately, just less than 150. That's more than half of the of delegates. And there have been great sacrifices that have been made to be here. Many will have to face the fact that they may not spend Christmas upon the end of returning home. And of course, the fact of COVID is a part of society here in Glasgow. So there are also dangers which a lot of negotiators this year are facing. But this is only a small story and part and parcel of understanding and documenting how small island states, or in this case, Pacific Island states, participate in negotiation, but also attempt to influence international politics through their messages and also their work in international negotiations. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you much, Dr. Carter, and I think you raise many poignant points. And one thing that I think was a recurring theme is that everyone has a role in climate change. And I think the Pacific is unique in that whether you are from the church or you are a young person or you represent an NGO, you're still part of the family. So you are not viewed differently from the negotiators. You may have your set agenda to be here, but by and large, because the Pacific is small and because climate change is everybody's responsibility, we all have a role here. And so I think this is why we have thought that this side event is very important, because we cannot, we can no longer be in negotiations where we need the Pacific Moral Authority and expect that our NGOs stay in another zone. And our NGOs are not here alongside us, because we all know it takes a village. And I think that is, you hit the nail on the head as well when you talk about the Pacific Coalition. And I think that is one of the strengths of Pacific people as resilient people. So thank you very much for sharing that, and also the layering and building the picture of all of the support that goes towards the work that we do here. And and I think we've come to a point in time where we are working now to bring in from capital our negotiators into our coordinating meetings. And at the same time, we have to care for the welfare and be mindful of the welfare of our negotiators, who have to leave here late in the night and come back in the dark of morning. And so it's a delicate balance. But I know that the way the Pacific exists as a unit, even across the biggest ocean, is what makes us resilient. So thank you very much. I would like to now invite my friend, Moana, who's representing the Tuvalu Climate Action Network. And I've seen a few interviews, Moana, that you have given, and I think a very strong and passionate speaker, but also one that comes from the front line. If there ever was a front line, it is in Tuvalu. And I think Tuvalu, your leadership has really led in terms of calling for greater ambition and demanding justice for not just Tuvalu, but for small island developing states. So I would like to invite you, Moana, to share some of your reflections from the coalition, from the network, and also as a Tuvaluan person here in Glasgow. Talofa.
Thank you very much, Tangaloa, for the opportunity to be part of this very important event. Yes, I come from Tuvalu, and we all know that Tuvalu is a very small island and it's vulnerable to any existential threat, especially when it comes to climate change related sea level rise. And I'm also here to tell a very simple story, that the people in Tuvalu do not want to move. And I think that is the basic message they've been trying to communicate in the past years, that we should not look into migration as part of the solution, but we should look into other alternatives and ways that we can maintain who we are as Tuvaluans, who we are as Pacific Islanders. And from a very significant perspective, especially when it comes to, in the Pacific, more than 90% are Christians, religious peoples. And we always fall back to our theological conscience when it comes to issues such as climate change related sea level rise. And we always tend to look into the Bible, especially the story of Noah, as a default text. The story of Noah, the story of Job. But I think we should move and change the narrative. Try to look into the story of the Good Samaritan. Try to look into the story of Tuaoi, or neighbor. What does it mean to be a neighbor in this geopolitical setting? What does it mean to be a geopolitical neighbor within the Pacific, and also how can we relate South and North through the concept of neighbor? I think that's a very important message for the COP, because the concept of neighbor does not only have that moral strain, but also depict our cultural identity. You know, neighbor is no longer a person living next door to you, but it's a geopolitical neighbor. So I think that's the very basic message that I want to bring across. You know, how do we treat our neighbor in the Pacific, you know? How do we treat our Pacific neighbor through traditional lens, through indigenous lens? And also, you know, Dr. Sala talked about diplomacy. How can we weave in the concept of neighbor into the diplomacy discussion? I think those very basic elements of our traditional culture, it's very important. You know, we always tend to forget and neglect, I would say, when it comes to climate change negotiation, the role of the church, the role of religious institutions. But when we go back after COPs, these political or negotiators will definitely come for some spiritual guidance when we go back. You know, it always seems to be that this is our fallback position. You know, when we are confronted with problems and issues, we go back to the church. And in the island, we don't see that division between church and state. We can see the division during daytime. You know, that's church and state. But nighttime, they will sleep on the same bed. You know, church and state, we don't have that distinctive demarcation of between church and state. So that notion is very important, especially when it comes to climate justice and saying that we are all on the same boat, but we are not. We're not on the same boat. We are sinking. We are drowning. So we need to move away from that notion of, you know, trying to romanticize our words, make those terms look very sexy and attractive, but they're not true. We really need to challenge ourselves, challenge our mindset. Is this really true? When it comes to we are all on the same boat, we are all on the same canoe, we have to paddle hard. These are cover-up terms, and we need to do away with that. We need to tell the international community that we are not on the same boat. We are not. We are not here to save the wildlife. We are not here to save the polar bears. We are here to save human beings. We have a problem. We are facing this problem, and we need solution. You know, most of the time when we talk about climate justice, we talk about saving the polar bears, saving the wildlife, you know, and trying to divert from this very basic problem that we are facing, is climate change. And people from Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands, which are not more than 3 meters above the sea, are sinking. We're facing this problem day by day. It's no longer the issue of the rising sea from the side of the islands. We are experiencing rising sea right in the middle of the airstrip. Waters are bubbling from underneath, challenges our security and our food security as well, agriculture sector and so forth. So we really need to be true. We really need to be true to ourselves and speak the truth. I think that is very important. We should not continue to use these cover-up terms to make, you know, in terms of diplomacy and negotiations, but I think we just need to highlight that very clear, that we need to save humanity. I think that's my simple message, and speaking on behalf of my kids and my communities and those who cannot make to COP26.
Wow. Thank you very much, Maina. That's a very passionate reflection. And one thing that you said earlier that I think goes to the heart of what would eventually happen if we don't keep this world to a 1.5 degree temperature. And that is, relocation is not a solution. Relocation should not be an option. And one thing that I think is missing in the corridors here is the traditional aspect of us as people, as Pacific Islanders. And as you were sharing that reflection, I thought about what it would mean for our people if they had to move to new locations. And when you do that, as a Pacific Islander, it is inevitable that you leave your traditional practices, because our traditional practices, our traditional medicine, our traditional indicators for a traditional early warning system is associated with our trees and our plants and our plant life. And it is associated with the coastal areas that we live in. And so it would change the makeup of our communities that have to move. And so you're right, it should not be an option. It is not the solution. And also, I think you also hit a really important point there, that there is in our construct as Pacific Island people, the church, state, NGOs are not separated in our traditional construct. Because why? Because the same people who run governments, they make up the church communities, they make up the village communities, they are in the NGOs. They'll wear 7 hats at one time. And so it's very difficult to draw those lines. And I think with that, although it's a limit, it limits us sometimes because it is overwhelming. It is also, I think, the core of what makes Pacific Islanders strong, is that you are not alone. And your analogy of the waka, I was thinking maybe some people are struggling to alo le waka in different directions. And when you do that, the waka won't move. So we are all here today. And our collective role is to support our negotiators in the room. And some of our negotiators are here today with us. Our role is to make sure that the waka moves in the right direction and that we're in charge of that narrative. So I now open the floor. Thank you very much. And I open the floor to any questions from the audience, if there are any questions to our panelists. And I, at the same time, while you're doing that, Vita, I will look if there are any questions in the chat. I don't see any questions here. Are there any questions from our audience? I know it's a bit late right now here in Glasgow, early morning in the Pacific. We have a question for Maina.
So Maina, you said that that we shouldn't romanticize terms and words like we're in the same boat, etc. What about when young people who are fighting for climate change within the communities, they use this term, we are not drowning, but we are fighting? What do you say to something like that?
Yes. Please respond.
The question It's very important and pertinent to the context of climate change. But when I say we are not on the same boat, I'm trying to depict the fact that in Tuvalu or in Pacific Islands that are sinking are not the same with the people in the north who are enjoying the luxury of life, while people in the south are drowning. So I think the notion of we are not drowning, we are fighting, I think it's pertinent. It's different from what I'm trying to demonstrate here, in the sense that we are, we always, when we hear people, when it comes to the context of climate justice, they normally use that word. We are on the same boat. We are with you together. We remember Tuvalu in your prayers. Don't pray. We don't need your prayers. Those kind of things, they tend to be hiding behind prayers, hiding behind these romanticizing words and make them very sexy and, appealing to the world. But they're not true. I think God is tired of our prayers. He is praying for us now to do something. I think we should try to move out of our comfort zone and try to end this romanticizing all these kind of things. I think that's my point. I hope I'm clear.
Thank you very much, Moana, I think that is quite clear. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Please. We have one over here. Wonderful.
It's an honor to be with you here. My name is Xavier Cortada, and I am an artist and a professor at the University of Miami, which is another world away. But I live at 6 feet above sea level. My home is literally 6 feet above sea level. And every now and then we have hurricanes that destroy portions of our city. And as sea level rises, they don't need to rise 6 feet. They could rise 3 feet. And if a hurricane like the one that hit Miami in 1992 were to hit, when our sea level rises 3 feet, the surge of the water will start in one side of Florida and pull through across to the other side, a Category 5 hurricane that is created by that warmth. As an artist, I have talked about Tuvalu, and I've talked about the Pacific Islands in my work. In the connection to the elevation that we have, and the reason I'm here at COP26 is to try to share with you the fact that we are neighbors, that we are global neighbors. And although I live in a city that looks and is extremely wealthy with big buildings, we are exceedingly vulnerable. And I don't want to move because it would be a disaster culturally. But I come from a family of refugees that left an island nation and were forced to move. And now the grandchildren of those refugees may be forced to move in the future. So I come to COP26 with outrage, but also with a sense of connection because it is so obvious at both of our coastlines. And that's why I created this project that I left in your office today, where I ask people not to identify by their name, but by their situation. In my case, my name tag doesn't say, "Hi, I am Xavier." It says, "Hello, my elevation is 6 feet." And I would like to share, and I was at your offices earlier today gifting that to you as a way of just wearing these around to try to create a sense of outrage that we need to act now. And that's the story I wanted to share with you as a global neighbor of yours.
Thank you very much. I think that's very creative to be identified by how high above sea level you are and you live. But having said that, Xavier, I come from a country where my home is very high above sea level, and yet a Category 5 tropical cyclone brought my country to its knees. And I think when you talk about the scale where small island states, tropical category 5s can cripple an entire economy. And it's happened so many times in the Pacific, to the point where I've heard Pacific leaders say, we just cannot afford to try and recover from tropical cyclones every year. And that is why you hear our leaders say that the global pandemic should not be an excuse to delay action on climate change, because climate change, as we know, will not wait and does not wait for anyone. Thank you very much for coming and joining our event. And you've come to the right place as an artist, because right after this, we will look at some artwork that has been developed, bespoke for the Pacific, to be heard in these corridors in Glasgow. So you need to stick around. Don't go away. And then I just want to turn quickly to some of the comments, to share some of the comments with the audience here that are coming through the chat. And one of the comments from a very good friend of SPREP and the Pacific, Kate Brown, who is with GLISPA. A lot of you remember Kate, who are from the Pacific. She said, this is a fantastic side event, and what would you recommend for the rest of us to do? And a question from Kate. So this is the question. What would you recommend for everyone else to do? Because she also says, I feel like people don't hear this voice, your voices, enough. Academia, the church, the young people, that we don't hear this enough. And what allies outside of the Pacific are most important to this fight? I will ask my mom first. And you can respond to any one of those. And then I will ask Salah. And then we go to my mom.
I think for me, when she asks what would we as a panel recommend for the rest of those who are tuning in, I would bring in accountability. As Maina had shared, how we're not in the same boat as those in the global north. And so using this climate dialogue or sharing, or when you're given the opportunity to speak, therefore, speaking truth to power, holding those who contribute so much to the climate crisis to be held accountable for their actions. And that would be one way to recommend, whether this would be done internationally, regionally, or even within your own local communities as well. Just really calling people out for their actions, and that is really important, so that these communities also have the agency to then flourish in the face of the crisis if you're able to speak truth to power and share out their stories through there. So that's how some of my recommendations I would give for the audience that is tuning in and for everyone here.
Thank you very much, Maima and George. Wait, specifically, Salah, what kind of allies do we need here today?
You know, when you hear the speeches by leaders on Monday, especially by U.S. Secretary General, you heard it in the speeches by the Modi Indian Prime Minister, you heard it at Scott Morrison, you heard it. When they start saying, we hear and we see it in terms of small island states, when they start saying that climate change is real, then you know moral diplomacy is working. When our voices become amplified by other leaders, when our voices are amplified through the media, when our voices are amplified through our negotiators, you know it's working. This this work that has been happening for the last 30 plus years by Pacific negotiators, by Pacific leaders, that, and for all of us, is do not ignore the message. Then you know that it's working. Because sometimes when you come to these meetings or where you're sitting at home watching the Zoom link, you feel like you're not doing anything. You're not part of this whole process, but you are. You are actually part of this invisible moral diplomacy of passing on that message. So it's not ignoring, but making sure that that message is heard within, whether it be in your local county in Miami, or whether it be in your schools, in your classrooms in Canberra, or whether it be at your coffee table in Washington, D.C., or whether it be in the homes in Tuvalu, in Funafuti. When that message that sits Pacific Island states are at the front line and they need address and in terms of more ambitious action, and you hear it in the speeches of leaders, then you know that the message that has been happening, or the actions that have been happening in terms of moral diplomacy of climate change, has been working. But do not ignore the message and continue on. I think that would be my message here today.
That the voices must still be heard. And that brings me right to the core, Salah, of this side event. That everybody has a voice. In the Pacific, everybody has a place. And when you have that, your voice, and you have that place, you have a moral authority. Do you know, and I just want to end with a couple of points, but one of our delegations was in the plenary when I think it was Costa Rica followed Palau. And I can't quote because I was not there, but some words to the effect that it's always a burden to follow Palau in these negotiations, in the plenary, because he feels, it weighs on his heart when he hears the stories. And Palau's statement was so powerful that it was felt by the next speaker. And so I think therein as well lies the strength of that diplomacy. And I think, to be honest, from a personal perspective, from a SPREP's perspective, as the organization who is here to support our countries, this has been the best time I've had this week. And it's at this panel. So I want to thank the panel. I want to thank you for your frankness. And I think we started with a really powerful statement from the Prime Minister of Samoa. And then we heard from some very real people from the Pacific. And so I would like to thank you, acknowledge you, and thank you very much for your time. And I think it helps us, it helps spread, it ground truths us. So I thank you for that, and I thank you on the behalf of the Secretariat, on behalf of the Director General of SPRED, and all of us who are here. And we continue to lift each other up while our families hold it down for us at home. So I want to say a big whakawelahi o e tulo kia tau tolu osi, and a whawhtai te lava to everybody back home who have tuned in. We are small in number, but we are loud in our presence here, and that work has